Okay, it's probably a good time to kick us off. I see we've got a fair number of people gathered. So welcome to everyone who is here, and welcome to a rather different dialogue. Up till now, we've had 4 dialogues on particular discrete topics with a number of very well-informed panelists, and we've heard debate between them. What we're going to do this time is summarize what we've heard from each of those first 4 dialogues, and then look ahead to what we might want to cover in the next series as we look at other aspects of the metaverse that need reflection, discussion, debate. So the metaverse has generated a huge amount of excitement, of course, and if it lives up to even a fraction of what some of the proponents promise, then it has the potential to be one of the most important visions, one of the most important changes of our generation. It potentially could change the entire way that we interact with each other, with objects, with the world around us, in a change to society that is every bit as profound as we've seen with the internet to date. That's the potential. But whilst there's a lot of promise, one of the problems, and we'll come back to this a lot, is it's often not clear quite what the metaverse actually is. What are we talking about here? And quite how will that result in the kind of change that people want to see happen and might well happen? And that, I think, is something that we will keep coming back to throughout this session and talk a bit more about it at the end as well. From my point of view, I think what I've seen is that there is what I would call a purist vision, the vision that's set out by people like Matthew Ball in the book that you see you may have a chance to win if you fill in the survey. And that purist vision, I think, is clear. It's a vision that sets out the idea of a virtual world that's very immersive, that's persistent, that can have an infinite number of participations, and that has interoperability between other virtual worlds. So that, to me, does seem to be clear. But when most people talk about the metaverse, they seem to talk about something rather different from that. And that's where we have the problems with the overall definition of quite what this actually is. Is it anything to do with VR, or indeed, is it anything to do with a virtual world, or is it to do with the intersection of the two, or is it to do with something more than that? And that lack of clarity clearly is something that needs to be resolved sooner or later. It's also worth just mentioning that over the brief time of these dialogues, we've seen a change in sentiment. So if we go back to the start of the dialogues, then everyone was very, very positive about the metaverse and intrigued and interested and wanting to be part of the story. What we've seen, of course, in the last few weeks is, particularly amongst the financial investor community, a lot more concern about whether the metaverse will deliver against the very large amounts of money that are now being spent in getting there. And on the back of that, a fair amount of commentary, I'm sure many of you have seen this in mainstream press and similar, asking questions like, well, does anyone know what the metaverse actually is? Why are you doing this? Where's it going? And that's, I think, important to be able to ask questions and to probe and to take a step back and pause briefly and ask, okay, we've got to a point where there's now extreme widespread interest in that. Now let's think about where we're going to direct that interest, where we're going to move ahead. So the dialogues themselves, we've had 4 dialogues. The first one was a fairly general dialogue, an introduction to the metaverse. And then we've been looking at the role of regulation in the metaverse, the issues around personal identities, and then the question of whether there needs to be standardization to deliver interoperability. Now, these, of course, are only 3 areas. There are many other areas, and indeed there are some in the poll that we might cover going forward. So I wouldn't in any way say that we've covered everything that's important. And I can think of many other issues, such as online harms, who owns the metaverse, whether it's going to be monopolistic or not, that are also pretty important too. And we may well come to look at those later on. But today what we're going to do is take a look at what we've learned, to talk a bit about where next, both in the context of the learnings from these particular seminars and also more broadly and many of the team are frequently out and about at conferences. I was at a Metaverse conference yesterday. So to pick up on what we're hearing as well in the wider context. So before we head into that, I'd encourage you all, please, to fill in the poll and to fill in the survey. It's pretty straightforward to do. It's fun, but it's also helpful to guide us as to where we're going next. And with that, it's time to move to the first of our Metaverse sessions, and that was one that was run by Mayanne. Mayanne, do you want to tell us a bit about what happened in your session and what you heard there?
Thanks, William. We started the Metaverse Dialogue, and my session was during the height of what William has described as the frenzy. Everybody was super enthusiastic about it, and we were all trying to figure out, oh my gosh, what on earth was the metaverse? And so we talked a lot in our session. It was more, I characterized my session, my first session of this, the first session of this whole entire dialogue as a cleansing sort of ritual where we all complained about we didn't understand what the metaverse was all about, and we wanted to have like a group session where we could talk about our feelings and what we encountered of the metaverse. And one of the things which we had as Access Partnership had come up with was a metaversality index, which looked a little bit like this. We talked about some of the attributes. We put together 7. Could you, for example, enter the metaverse? Could you have a presence in the metaverse? What kind of mechanisms for identity and representation and avatars were there? Could you go home? Could you travel within the metaverse? How could you discover places within the metaverse, however you wanted to describe it? What were the characteristics and the requirements for interoperability and standards? What were the regulations around data protection, privacy, and safety? What were the rules around virtual media, artifacts, markets, and transactions? For example, a lot of kids are actually creating artifacts online, and where's the child labor laws, I suppose, when it comes to that? And of course, the interactivity and interfaces that we handle, the virtual reality, the augmented reality, and the various devices. By the way, if you want the copy of this Metaversality Index, just please drop us an email. I'm more than happy to be sending it over to you. But we were in that first webinar really trying to put handles around this concept of the metaverse. Was it a metaverse? Was it many metaverses? And as long as you had a virtual world, was that therefore considered a metaverse? And I think that a lot of those discussions sort of panned out and made a little bit of runway for where we started to discover and explore different other avenues to discuss. So I think, William, this is really where we started from. I hope I've given you a broad overview. Again, this document is very, very much available to all of you. Happy to hear comments on it. But back to you to give us a little bit more fleshed out ideas of where we went to after that.
Thank you, Mayanne. Yes. So where do we go next? So the next stop on our metaverse journey, having kind of got a bit of a handle on what roughly we're talking about, was to start to talk about a constitution and broadly the regulations and the overall kind of environment that might or should sit around the metaverse. And that was a session that was run by Sophia. Sophia, what did we hear during that session?
Yes, thank you, William. Hi, everyone. Indeed, so we had the Metaverse Constitution Dialogue, which was the second webinar that we organized within the Metaverse Policy Lab, and that took place around the month of July this year. And at the time, we had the opportunity to listen to our 3 panelists who shared their views on topics such as the status of regulations of present platforms and technologies, and how this may affect upcoming metaverse regulations. How should rules be built? What are the key challenges, the main concerns to be addressed around the concept of the metaverse as such, but also the technologies that are being used to enable the deployment of this technology. So maybe to summarize some of the takeaways that we discussed during that session, I would say the first one was the importance of educating yourself. There is so much uncertainty around this topic, a lot of conversations around, but still a lot of questions. So probably the main, the first message from the dialogue was the importance of educating yourself, whether you are a company interested in the economic benefits that the metaverse can bring to you, or you're a regulator concerned about safety and protection of society, or maybe you're just a user who is excited about seeing this metaverse concept in real life. You need to educate and learn yourself and learn about this issue as soon as possible. And education is also a collaborative process. It's not a standalone thing that you can do by yourself. So educating, having collaboration between companies, developers, but also governments and regulators, academics, users, so people who are really interested and want to engage in this subject need to have proper conversations about this. The second highlight would be the importance of regulations, because there is kind of a trend that there are a lot of emerging technologies that are kind of trying to escape from regulations. And is it the metaverse the case as well? Well, I would say that there was a general agreement on the importance of having regulations. There doesn't seem to be a doubt on that. We are moving into a more immersive experience, or at least that's the overall objective. Therefore, applying the current regulations that we have might not be enough. That's why the speakers during my session, they talk about smart regulations. Some rules that we already have might remain and might stay, while others will need to evolve and will have to be rethink in order to cope with the needs of the users. So again, while we already have some regulations, some Digital Act, GDPR, data privacy rules, etc., all that was thought more for 2D or 3D experiences and not really for this immersive new concept. So that's where the real challenge is, in identifying and rethinking what we have. So to wrap up, the main message that that I want to express from this conversation was that government and companies interested in fostering the evolution of this new platform of the metaverse, they will have to ensure three key things. One is to educate stakeholders, second, to protect users, and third, to build trust.
Thank you, Sophia. And I was just sort of thinking back and reflecting on, I'm a bit older than most of the rest of you, so I can remember what happened when the internet, both version 1.0 and 2.0 was introduced. And if we'd asked that question back then, should we have regulation, should we have a constitution? The answer would have been overwhelmingly absolutely not. You can't possibly regulate something that doesn't exist, or at least that nobody quite knows where it's going, and therefore regulations are either going to be outdated or they might prevent innovation. And of course, the world's a different place now. In a way, we've learned from that, and we've learned from some of the harms and some of the issues that we see with the existing internet. And we kind of know that you do need regulation. And applying regulation retrospectively is harder than applying it in advance in terms of making it stick, but obviously harder to get right. So did you get any, Phil? Have you got any views on, should we regulate, and how do we overcome this kind of trying to regulate something that doesn't really exist without knowing quite where it's going to go?
Okay. Yeah, so let me maybe start from the end, because we are talking about something that doesn't exist yet. And that's kind of a big question. Does the metaverse exist? Because if you go out there and Google metaverse, you might be invited to join some kind of metaverse from certain companies, events being hosted in the metaverse. So there is a lot of uncertainty and a lot of kind of confusion around that. The way the metaverse is being advertised and discussed, at least, we understand it as an immersive virtual world that is facilitated by the use of virtual reality, VR, AR, these new headsets, AI. So while something that futuristic doesn't exist as such, companies, organizations claim to have their own metaverse, as I said. So again, there's a big question mark out there. But to give some clarity, at least, although this is under discussion, the one thing sure is that the metaverse concept does exist. There is a lot of interest and a lot of effort from many big companies, very clever people working behind this, trying to develop this immersive virtual reality. So what we are seeing now are, in my opinion at least, a test. We are trying out the current technologies to see what they allow us to do. And this is moving fast, really fast, evolving quicker than we can imagine maybe. So having this in mind, should we be concerned about regulations in the metaverse? Yes, I would say that's at least clear. We should be concerned about, and we should be following how regulations will evolve. We should be following developments from the technical perspective in this area in order to better understand and predict problems and also find solutions from a regulatory perspective. It's difficult to understand, of course, all potential problems since the metaverse, as I said, it's still kind of a test mode from my perspective. But the sooner we educate ourselves, the better, since that will allow people to understand and predict situations. I mentioned it, like we are moving to this immersive ecosystem. We already have some kind of, for example, in Europe, we have GDPR, we have privacy rules, we have digital acts, tax regulation, child and sexual protection rules. So we have that kind of stuff yet out there, but as I said before, it's not really thought for this kind of immersive realities. It's more like for the ones that we have today, the platforms that we're currently use. And that's why the speakers during my session, they were talking about these smart regulation concepts that I mentioned before. And another important issue is that we don't only need smart regulations. We need also consistency. We need a consistent legal framework. It's not enough if one company has good policies in place or one country is aware of the importance of these issues or they're working on it. That's not going to be enough. So regulators have a really big responsibility here. First, they need to understand what this is all about, what's going on, and then they need to engage with other stakeholders to educate themselves, to better understand these issues, especially taking into account that sometimes regulators do not come from technical backgrounds. Sometimes they are like lawyers like me. So you need a lot of effort, at least from my perspective, to understand these issues. Another thing probably that I think we should bear in mind when we talk about regulations is that the metaverse will not be the safest place on Earth because that just doesn't exist. Like any other technologies, there's going to be a trade-off between benefits and risk. And this is exactly why, this is the reason of the importance of regulators and users to educate themselves so they can measure that trade-off and they can understand how much they want to be involved, to understand the risk. In that sense, maybe to wrap up a bit, but companies are leading kind of the path in this sense because they're the one working on the technology, investing a huge amount of money, hiring the most intelligent people on Earth to work on this. So they have a big responsibility in the sense of giving security, trust. They have to, in my point of view at least, they have the responsibility of self-regulating themselves to ensure a high degree of transparency and therefore brings confidence and trust among users and regulators. So that's something very important. And in terms of education, because I said this a lot of times, and some people might say, okay, but how do I do this? Well, joining this kind of webinar, it's a good way to do that. But of course, I would say that the most important thing is to be curious and to speak, to explore, to talk with people, to engage in conversation. If after this webinar, anyone has any kind of question, doubt, whatever, it's important that you come back to us. We want to discuss about this topic because this is the only way to generate knowledge. So that's really important. Nobody has all the answers, that's for sure. And if someone claims to have them, it's a big liar. But at least we need to foster discussions. We need to meet with like-minded people to try to be one step of the curve if we don't want to fall out of this trend.
That's some really useful input. And I think particularly, I like your point that ultimately it's the regulators that make the regulations, but they can't do it in isolation, not in this case. Maybe with some very static world they can, but here they need to very much engage. And indeed, it's in the interest of everyone to engage to make sure that those regulations are shaped well. One last quick question for you. We've kind of got to a situation in the social media world where we are pretty much, well, we tend to have to require almost companies like Facebook or Twitter or whatever to self-regulate. Do you think that's going to be the same in the metaverse? And if it is, do you think we can rely on those companies to do that any better than they have done in the past?
So if we should expect that companies will self-regulate, I would say no, I don't think we should expect that. I think we should demand that. I think that we should have these conversations today to raise awareness, to build capacity on what this is and how it might affect us. And I'm talking first, maybe as a user who could be very much interested in using these platforms, but also as a lawyer who has the chance to work in a consulting firm that provide who support companies, very relevant companies in this field. And I can say, I think that from my point of view, this is fundamental. So I wouldn't expect this to happen for the sake of it, but I think we need to talk based on empirical evidence. I mean, from how regulators and prosecutors work, the way they do their investigations, how they treat certain issues, the way they don't really understand them. When companies have policies, compliance processes in place, code of conduct, and they can prove certain kind of efforts to self-regulate themselves, they can reduce the risk. They can have better solutions and answers to the users, to the regulators, to any kind of stakeholder. So I think it's important to find this best solution working together, cooperation, engagement, that's fundamental. And I think it's something that we have to work on, not to expect it as such. But I'm still confident, like I'm very positive in general.
That sounds right to me. So thank you. So I guess overall, it feels like there's a pretty big weight of opinion that regulation is going to be important here, and that's very understandable given what we've seen in the development of the internet up till now. But and we need to learn from sort of ways we currently regulate what hasn't worked. But we need to build something collectively rather than just expect the regulators to head off, go to their back rooms, put their thinking caps on, and come out with the perfect form of regulation for something that is still a rather uncertain entity. Okay, let's move on. So having looked at regulation, we then turn to look at identities and digital identities. And I'm smiling to myself because the conference I was at yesterday, a number of people who were dialing in, it was a mixed conference, a real world and a virtual conference. And a number of people that were dialing in were calling themselves Elon Musk, I guess, since he's been in the news a lot, and particularly when there's any discussion about Twitter. So we had no end of participants called Elon Musk. Now, maybe one of them was Elon Musk, who can tell? And that's, of course, the problem with digital identities. Anya, do you want to talk us through what happened in your session?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, William. I think your example there highlights well the many issues relating to digital identity in the metaverse and how we can actually know who is who. But from the start, we had the dialogue on digital identity in mid-September, and we were joined by more than 100 participants with an expert panel. It was a great session, and we had views from different stakeholders. We had the academic view, we had journalistic view, and we had also private sector representatives joining the discussion. And digital identity, as my aunt mentioned as well, is one of the key attributes in the Metaversality Index. So it's definitely one of the core issues to look at when we discuss the metaverse. So maybe as a point of departure, one of the key learnings, at least for me, delving deeper into the issue of digital identity, is that I realized how broad it is, and also that there's no agreement on what digital identity in the metaverse specifically is at this stage. So we really had to scope down the discussion so we decided to focus on the social aspect of digital identity through the lens of avatars and their digital assets, such as NFTs or cryptocurrencies, could be digital fashion items, and etc. Because you also have the conversation on digital identity more from the cybersecurity perspective, and more the technical layer of it, which is probably more known to many from more like a general digital identity conversation, not necessarily from the metaverse perspective per se, but we decided to focus on the social interactions and how people appear in the metaverse, which is also really, really important, noting your example here, William, on Elon Musk. So we had two streams of discussion. We started out with trying to kind of put down some ideas on what digital identity in the metaverse can be, and then moving forward to addressing issues of digital identity in the metaverse. And what we also realized is that I'd say we didn't really agree on one sort of definition on digital identity in the metaverse, because first of all, we had to have the discussion about what the metaverse is, and we realized that many of our participants, a few of the experts in the panel, they also disagreed about whether the metaverse exists or not. So I think this just takes us all back to the start, what has already been mentioned, right? That in order to have these conversations about the policy areas in the metaverse, digital identity is one of them. We also need to actually figure out what the metaverse is in the first place. So a lot of the conversation turned back to what the metaverse actually is and whether it exists, before we turn back to digital identity. And we touched upon many different topics. I'd say probably the three key ones relates to interoperability and how one digital identity can move from one virtual world to another virtual world or metaverse platform. Secondly, we spoke about security. And thirdly, we spoke about the ethics of avatars in the metaverse, specifically in relation to their appearance. So in terms of interoperability, I remember a key discussion related to it relates to digital inclusion as well, because given the fact that many tech companies today are based in the Western world and they have the Western perspective, we were also discussing how can we include other companies from other parts of the world, and how will this be interoperable in terms of digital identity? How will the avatars appear? Will users be able to portray themselves in accordance with their real identity, or will we have kind of a really Western-oriented metaverse, if that makes sense? So I think that really reflects back to how metaverse conversations will also focus on digital inclusion in addition to digital identity. And then we also spoke about security, as mentioned. This discussion was mostly related to how to actually know other users are. If they claim to be Elon Musk, then are they really Elon Musk, or who are they, right? So they can. This discussion relates to how a user might be a person, but pretending to be someone else, but also it could be a bot, right? Not really a person behind it. So there's many issues in terms of digital identity to address from the security perspective. that is linked to bots. It could be phishing attempts as well as deepfakes, which is a key issue from also a social media perspective. So I think the discussion in the dialogue focused a lot about how phenomena from the social media world, such as bots and deepfakes in particular, can have an amplified effect in the metaverse from a security perspective. And then finally, in terms of the ethics of avatars, I remember we had an example. We used actually the fashion industry and how the fashion industry is really keen on engaging the metaverse in terms of creating NFTs and digital fashion items in the metaverse. And if I remember correctly, Vogue Business had an announcement that model agencies wanted to use kind of the picture or the 3D real world model of real models in the metaverse, like a photorealistic avatar, basically, and whether that is ethical. That was an interesting discussion, and there were different views that issue as well. From the industry perspective, they argued that they didn't see it as unethical, but they could also see potential issues around it. But there were also views that, at least if avatars is supposed to be photorealistic in the metaverse, it is really important from a privacy and data protection perspective as well to actually safeguard the rights of that person, right? And there was a really interesting example from one of the speakers. He mentioned a potential concept of body rights, just like we have copyright, and how we can protect avatars' appearance in terms of the look, basically. Yeah, I think that briefly summarizes what we discussed during the dialogue on digital identity.
Thank you, Anya. That's really helpful. And I think some of the points you made clearly very, very true. So back to my Elon Musk example, it's kind of fine when these are just names appearing in a chat room because you kind of know it isn't, probably not. But when it's someone that really does look like him, then it becomes much harder to make a judgment as to whether that's really the case or not. So you touched upon kind of the three key things that were picked up in the debate: the interoperability, the security, and the ethical side. Was there anything that wasn't touched upon, but you would kind of pull out as important to emphasize in terms of digital identity in the metaverse?
Absolutely. I think after the hour, we were all kind of keen to continue the discussion because there's so many different topics to touch upon just within digital identity. So one of them is the socioeconomic aspect of digital identity in the metaverse. For example, we've seen digital artwork being sold for $69.3 million US, and for example, a Gucci bag was sold for $4,000 US, which is actually more than the real life value. And if you have users doing this in the metaverse, will that kind of separates users into different socioeconomic groups, like we see in the real world, for example? I think that's an interesting discussion to touch upon, which could be a potential webinar in the future, who knows? And secondly, I also think we need to discuss more vulnerable user groups, especially youth and children, because it's already been reported cyberbullying and sexual harassment, hate speech, and these things in the metaverse. And I think this refers back to what has been said previously about the metaverse code of conduct as well, that industry stakeholders as well as governments, regulators need to cooperate on establishing some sort of metaverse code of conduct, because the metaverse is not a game, it's actually a real world, it's just virtually and in a way. So it's important to make sure that everyone is safe in the metaverse. So that's a safety discussion as well. And then one more thing I think it's important to address is the concept of freedom of expression, especially relating to the discussion on whether the metaverse is supposed to be centralized or decentralized. Because potentially, if we can say whatever we want in the metaverse, right? Who's supposed to address that? There's no centralized government in the metaverse, or who knows? But it doesn't seem to be. So we need to have measures in place to address these things as well, and that also relates to the issue of hate speech, for example, as well as terrorist content. We've already seen examples of this as well. How organizations like Daesh, for example, has leveraged the metaverse to attract new users as well. So yeah, I think that's my top 3 for now.
Thank you, Anya. Some really useful reflections there. And the Gucci bag that was sold for more than its real life existence came up yesterday. I still can't get my head around it. It wasn't me that bought it, by the way. It potentially is the indication of something really important, or an indication that people don't quite know what's going on out there. But time will tell on that front. Let's move this on. I'm conscious that we are a fair way into our time now, and come to the last of our dialogues, which is one I know better than the others because I was actually one of the panelists. And this was a dialogue on interoperability, which was admirably chaired by Paula. Paula, do you want to give us a summary of what you heard during that session?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be part of this webinar along with so many great colleagues. So the webinar on interoperability was the one just before the one we're having today. And for those who are unable to join, it's worth saying that interoperability is often described as a critical element for the metaverse. So many people say that for the metaverse to depict the real world, like we were saying just now, the sense of commonness and interoperability that we experience in our real world would need to be in the digital world as well. So just for an example, in the real world, this means I am myself and I'm able to wear these clothes here at my place, and that I myself will look the same or pretty much the same in the office and anywhere I go. In the digital world, an interoperable metaverse means that I would be able to jump from one world, from one platform to another without changing my avatar, so my identity, the way I look, my wallet, and my digital assets. And given the importance that is being given to interoperability, there are some efforts to create standards for the metaverse. But they're, of course, at the very infancy of their work. They're just starting everything because, like we've been saying as well, the metaverse is itself a concept that is still in the making, and we're still trying to understand and get our head around. So during our webinar, we wanted to explore this. We asked our speakers whether they thought that interoperability is key to the metaverse, and address other questions such as what interoperability is, what are the challenges involved, how can we address those challenges, and what are the opportunities as well, because there are a few. So we had 3 speakers, one of them being William, who is our moderator for today's session. Then Jason Matasu, who works in the corporate standards group at Microsoft, and Pedro Batista, who is a lawyer in a law firm in Brazil and works at intersection between law, technology, internet governance, policy. So a lot of cool stuff. So to start off, Jason provided a very useful definition of what standards are. And this was absolutely key because standards are the backbone of the discussion we had. And yet it's not a very easy concept to fully grasp if you don't have the engineer background like myself, and if you don't work in a set like directly with it. So William shared his views on whether interoperability is key. Maybe we can talk about it later in more details. And Pedro shared his initial reactions to the topic or to the metaverse, what he understands. Is it a buzzword? Is it more? What can we expect? And things like this. So for just my brief initial remark, I would say that there were divergent opinions on the criticality of interoperability. So, for instance, William is of the opinion that it would be desirable. It could be desirable, but it's not critical. And on the other hand, we had a CEO of a company called Supersphere. He was actually he was attending the webinar where he raised his hand during the Q&A, and he was given the floor. And so he's the CEO of this company that produced music experience for the metaverse. And his views were pretty much the opposite. So that was quite interesting to see someone from a different perspective and having a different view. At a high level takeaway, I would say that all speakers agreed to some extent that there is a trade-off between standardization and innovation that needs to be considered. Because if you have everyone abiding by a specific standard, you have less room for innovation, and that's pretty obvious. Also, there's a need to understand what the incentives are for each player to abide by standards and to work towards interoperability. So the truth is that the conversation, like we were having here, is often based on consumer experience because it's fun to talk about it and because it's how we're going to experience as like the end user. But the reality is that there is the whole enterprise side of the discussion and the economic incentives that make the world turn, I guess. And it would be expected that at this point, everyone is trying to be new or trying to be the first in the market, which would mean that these agents have potentially less incentives in being interoperable, depending on where on the value or the chain of the metaverse you are. And there is still this concept of the winner takes it all. So you want to be the first and you want to get there by yourself, I guess. Still on the questions to whether interoperability is key, there was also the common understanding, and this has been, I think, common across all the different sessions, is that the answer will vary according to the definition of the metaverse. So it goes back to the question of what is a metaverse, and is there a singular definition, or are there many different metaverse, which I think we tend to agree. But then are there 2 metaverses, 4, 500? And then this, of course, will determine is it desirable, is it even feasible? So these are all questions that needs to be answered as well. And even if there are multiple, and depending on the number of them, for some, interoperability may not be critical, and maybe it's not even desirable in some cases. So yes, it's a difficult question to be answered, but maybe we can go into more details as well later.
Thanks, Paula. And by the way, I'm keeping half an eye on the chat whilst this is going on, and there's some great stuff on there. So please, our audience, please do keep the chat coming, and I'll try and weave some of that in at the end. But it's really useful to see that and to see that debate unfolding there. So Paula, you mentioned 2 words, interoperability and standards. Can you sort of tell us a bit more how you think they relate to each other?
Yeah, absolutely. This was something that Jason touched on, and I will be using mostly of his words because I wouldn't be able to describe better myself. But I think the simplest way to define interoperability is when diverse systems are able to communicate between each other to enable elements and functionality and exchange data. And I think something important to understand is that this concept in the metaverse is absolutely no different than it has been for computing, for telecommunication, and other technologies over time. And I think the second takeaway, and I think that was the most important for me, was that an interoperable system, it can be enabled by many things. So with standards tend to be a common focus of the discussion, but it's not the only way to get an interoperable system. So you can have private parties partnerships, which are agreement between private organizations that can establish mechanisms to interoperate. And interoperability can also be achieved through other ways, such as collaborative deployment of open source software technologies. So standards is a way to get there, but not only one.
Thank you. And just picking up on one other point. So we don't really have standards for a lot of what we do in the internet at the moment. At least at the high level, we don't have a standard for for a chat room or a standard for a social media platform. I'm just looking at the comments. Certainly, we do have standards for the deep underlying plumbing of the internet, but not for the kind of the higher level type of stuff. Why should we have standards for the metaverse if we've got this far without a standard for Facebook or a similar kind of organization?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I don't know if we should. I think we're still answering this question. But I think in a way we have learned how monopolies tend to develop in social media without standards, and how and the challenges and the issues that may come with this. So we might want to be a bit ahead of the game and think of how standards may be able to address those challenges in the metaverse. But I think maybe it's useful to say something that also was brought up during the conversation, is that in a way, interoperability should be mandated, at least from the discussion. That's how we understood. So Jason provided a very insightful example to explain this. For instance, I can produce a phone that does not support 5G. There's nothing that stops me from doing so, right? So if that said, if it doesn't connect to any network, I'm pretty sure nobody will want to buy the phone I'm producing. Yet I'm still allowed to market it. But when you mandate, it's a problem. You're constraining, you're blocking innovation and not opening for innovation. Whereas if you allow for the market dynamics to evolve, you have something like Bluetooth that it will determine whether people want to abide by standards or not. So nowadays we have something around 40,000 companies using Bluetooth, and it's not a mandate for companies to support Bluetooth. Yet they want to do it because it's good for their own services. It gives them they have incentives for doing so without having to necessarily do it. That makes sense.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think to that example, there are also standards that were developed for other kind of Bluetooth-like communication systems in the past that we don't remember now because they fell by the wayside because they weren't the ones people chose. So in a way, there was a choice of different standards and a focus on some because they best fit the direction the industry wanted to go in. Okay, so we've got about 10 minutes left in our session. What I'm going to do now is ask all of our rapporteurs to come together and just to pick up on what we thought the areas of commonality and differences were across all of our sessions, and then I'll try and wrap it all up in the last 5 minutes. So bringing everyone in, first of all, what do we think we heard as commonalities across all of these things? Not just necessarily the buzzwords, but the sort of underlying feelings. And if anyone wants to leap in and throw in a few observations in that area.
I think the first thing that I would take away is, and especially because I do see I've been participating in the chat. Thank you everybody, by the way, for those people who are obviously not paying attention like me and typing in the chat. One thing which I feel is really important when we start talking about the metaverse is that we need to define really clearly what we're talking about, because even when we talk about something as simple as identities, you can talk about standards, you can talk about interoperability, and that's a completely different, set of discussions. And yet you also want to talk about anonymity and their existing regulations, and then you can also talk about child protection. So I think that the really important thing that I took away from all of the discussions is that, you have to really be laser focused on discussing what you want to discuss. Not to say that you can't discuss other things, but in order to get somewhere with one topic, you kind of need to really focus. And it will sound a bit exclusionary, but you have to put things aside in order to focus and go deep and resolve some of the questions that you need to. I don't know if Paula, Anya, Sophia, you felt the same way as well, because I think that we really went all over the place.
No, I totally agree with you, Mayan, and I think it's really important just to start a conversation over again about what the metaverse is, because I've also noticed other conversation about people trying to attempt to name the metaverse differently, because the metaverse, what meaning does it actually has? Because I feel like it's so broad now and it encompasses so many things. So when you start thinking about the metaverse, what does it actually mean? And then I noticed this week that there was someone suggesting to name it the virtual web instead. So just the fact that people are trying to name it differently signals, to me at least, that we need to have a discussion about the metaverse, like as a concept.
Yes, I also heard someone last week saying that we should call it the betterverse once we have like the perfect version of it. But maybe something that I would like to touch upon, talking about things in common, what we agree, disagree. I feel like there is a lot of discussion that people are asking themselves, should I get involved in the metaverse? Is it like a waste of time or money? Is it going to collapse and I'm going to ruin all my budget or not? Or is it this is actually the future of technology? So whether we need the metaverse or not, I'm not sure. Maybe my needs are a bit more basic. But what I think we need to do regarding the metaverse is to be involved. And I say this because if the metaverse never actually reaches the expected level, and it never really becomes what people are expecting to be, that doesn't mean that all the effort, all the investment, all the knowledge that we are building in this process of creating this potential new technology, it's going to be a waste of time, because during this process, I can see already a lot of very interesting development, a lot of very interesting knowledge that we're building, discussions we are having. So if a company today is doubting whether they should maybe do something about it, like should we have a unit working on the metaverse? Should we have policies to maybe be one step ahead and be ready in case this actually happens? I feel like everything that's happened today, it's leading us, it's kind of the seeds of what the next technological revolution will be. And that's just around the corner. I don't know if it's going to be called the metaverse, or it's going to be called something different, or from all this process, we end up in another place that we didn't expect. But people who are already involved, informing themselves, building knowledge, capacity, having these conversations, they're going to be much better prepared than those who are not engaged to face this technological revolution that it's coming, that's going to be there. So I'm not that much concerned about the name we use, but I'm much more concerned about keeping an eye on it, being informed, because I don't think anyone wants to miss out.
That sounds very sensible. And Paula, any thoughts from you as to sort of commonalities, differences, just anything that jumps out at you?
I think the webinar I was moderating was an example of where we fairly felt like had a common understanding of things. People really have different views on almost everything, which was super interesting as well. But just building up on what Sophia, Mayan, and Nani was saying, I think also there's something funny about we're asking ourselves, are we going to be in the metaverse? Are we going to be interested about it? But if you think about it, how much time do we already spend on our phone, like just scrolling and seeing people's pictures? If you think about it, it's not interesting at all, but yet we do it, right? And imagine if it's just a little bit better than that. It's a little bit more interactive. You can actually feel like you're touching your friend, or that could be so much more fun and interesting than what we have already.
That's a really positive note to sum up on. So let me try and bring this to a close with a nearly impossible task of trying to come up with something vaguely coherent from everything that we've talked about over all of these 4 different forums with so many different participants, with so much interesting chat. And I think I would agree absolutely with the point that a number of my colleagues have just raised, which is nobody really knows what the metaverse is, or at least some people think they've got one particular vision, but then there's others with a quite different vision. And that lack of any kind of common understanding makes it very, very difficult to decide what should be the right rules around identity or whatever, because in some cases, identity could be really important. In other cases, it could be almost completely irrelevant. And I've seen many different versions of views on what the metaverse might actually be. There's certainly, as I mentioned at the start, what I call the purist view, the view put forward by people like Matthew Ball and others, which essentially is an environment that is persistent, that is interoperable, and allows an unlimited number of people to participate. And that mirrors the kind of sci-fi worlds that first came up with the term metaverse. But then I've seen others that might say, well, actually, some of the gaming platforms we have right now are metaverses. You can go visit the metaverse because you can go and play Fortnite with a VR headset on, and that's the metaverse. Others would say, no, that can't be the metaverse because it isn't interoperable. But then what does interoperable mean when one gaming platform might be medieval fights with dragons and another might be building a starship? And frankly, anything that's relevant in one is pretty much irrelevant in the other, I would have thought, although I'm not much of a gamer. Then, of course, there's the definition that anything that is VR is the metaverse, or indeed that the metaverse can only be VR. And those two very much get conflated. And I've been looking at Meta's recent advertisements for what they call the metaverse. And they're really sort of VR experiences, like school children visiting ancient Rome to see what it looked like. That's not a kind of a purist metaverse. That's more of a specific VR application, and a very good one. I'm not saying anything wrong with it. It's just a different kind of definition. Another definition is anything that's in a virtual world. And indeed, Meta recently announced that you could access, or will soon be able to access, Horizon Worlds, their kind of embryonic metaverse, with a two-dimensional interface. So that means that in their definition, at least, the metaverse doesn't necessarily mean immersive. It doesn't necessarily mean VR. But then how's that any different from Second Life or some of the other kind of virtual worlds that we've had for quite some time? And then we see, and indeed at the conference I was at yesterday, things like virtual surgery making a comeback. And you can imagine that there are some extremely good healthcare applications of VR, but that doesn't feel like a metaverse to me. I can't imagine that an infinite number of people would want to jump into an operation and be interoperable and persistent during the time that somebody's having open heart surgery. So there's all those different things, and I think there'll be people who will put their hand up for some or all of those. So it's very hard to say actually the right answer is X or Y. And I think what we need to do, to the point that was raised earlier, is perhaps to try and separate these into a different set of taxonomies. The purist metaverse, the gaming metaverse, the virtual world metaverse, the relatively niche or constrained metaverse that's to do with surgery and so on. And for each of them, start to ask the questions that we've been trying to ask, such as identity. And as I said earlier, the answers then will be quite different. For example, is it important that your identity is absolutely correct when you're playing Fortnite or some other game? No, in fact, the whole point of that almost is to be someone different, not to be yourself. But is it important that your identity is correct if you're in a chat room? That feels like that's a much more critical answer. So it does feel that trying to separate these out into separate areas and then asking the same questions that we've been asking now for each one feels like it might be a useful way to move ahead. And it feels to me as well that it's now a good time, a natural time has come about almost to ask a few more critical questions. We've got to the point where there's a lot of enthusiasm for the metaverse. We probably don't need to worry about a lack of enthusiasm bringing it forward, and we can actually start to allow ourselves a little bit of criticality to listen to concerns, to ask those sort of questions around where's this going, who's going to make money from it, how's it going to work, and how's it different from other things that have existed in the past, in order to help inform the debate around all of that. So I don't think I've actually really answered much there, but we do have one answer, which is that we've been running a poll, of course, as to what we should cover next. And I don't have the results in front of me, but I don't know if, Luca, you can leap in and tell us what the results are, or bring them up, or something like that at this point in time. Are you able to do that?
The results are for financial transactions in the metaverse, 39%.
Okay, very interesting. So that's where we need to go next. We need to look at those virtual Gucci handbags and make sure that the person, whoever's buying it, is absolutely certain that they have what they paid for. Well, that's the end of the time that we've got allotted. Thank you ever so much for all of those of you who've been tuned in and been contributing so well to the chat. And I'm sure there'll be others who'll be watching it later. Thank you for your attention, and we will be back. But for now, that's enough of the metaverse for today. Let's return to the real world for a bit. Thank you, everyone, and goodbye.
Bye-bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.